Okay, so let me begin by saying what a great honor it is to be here and to be the recipient of the Olof Palme Professorship. So Olof Palme has an almost legendary status, not only in Sweden, but also internationally. And so to be awarded the Olof Palme Professorship is a particular honor for me, and I'm humbled and grateful for the opportunity. And one of the aspects of giving a lecture like this is it gives me the opportunity to publicly thank some of the people who are responsible for getting me here. And one never knows who exactly is responsible because these are bureaucratic institutions, but I'm going to give it a try. So first, of course, I'm extremely grateful to the Swedish Research Council, which awarded me the professorship and funded it. And I also owe thanks to people at the University of Stockholm, which is a very a rich research place to be in. And I know I owe thanks to Michelle Micheletti, Ulf Merkenstam, Ludwig Beckman, Eva Ehrman for the invitation and for the application for the visiting professorship, Agneta Sudman-Clausen, Marcus Furendal, Sophie Trozel for help with all kinds of practical matters, in 2 cases helping me find a flat, which wasn't easy, and just various different practical matters related to the visit and the lecture. And I hope I didn't do violence to the pronunciation of your names. Okay, so I'm going to begin my talk by connecting the topic to, which is territory, why we need a theory of territory, to Olof Palme himself. So he exemplified, I think, to the world the third way between capitalism and socialism. And he's usually thought of as just as a proponent of a strong welfare state. But of course, he really had at least 3 strong political commitments: to social justice, which I take as involving rights and freedoms, equality, the rule of law, strong welfare rights to make those rights and freedoms possible and valuable for the majority of citizens. He had a commitment to democracy, which we usually understand as a political system in which citizens authorize the law that applies to them through participation in democratic procedures. And he was also committed to decolonization, or what we might call anti-imperialism. So throughout his career as a politician and as prime minister, also in his capacity as special mediator to the UN, president of the Nordic Council, he condemned imperialism in all its forms. And he emerged as the central Western positive voice for the non-aligned movement, and also supported many different developing countries' liberation movements against various forms of imperialism, French imperialism, British imperialism, and so on. So fidelity to these 3 different values, to justice, democracy, and decolonization, animated his political career and are central to what we now think of as a progressive social democratic outlook. But in fact, I want to argue that it's not all that easy to align these values. In Olof Palme's case, of course, he probably thought that the third issue, which involved territorial and membership issues, was solved. In many places, it is solved. In the case of Sweden, at least since the secession of Norway, the membership and territories question could recede into the background. But for some places, membership, who is a member, and territory, what territory and what their boundaries are ongoing sources of political conflict and can't be understood straightforwardly in terms of either justice or democracy. And that territorial and democratic membership question emerges in the commitment to decolonization. It's hard to understand when we examine why we're committed to decolonization. I think we have to examine that question. So I think there are 3 different important questions of political order and 3 different sources of political legitimacy. And these sources overlap in various ways, but they are distinct. So first, there is justice. And justice, I take it as a response to the question, what kind of policies, practices, and principles should be adopted to govern the basic institutional structure, either of society or of the global order? So it's a question of the fairness or substantive justice of the principles or policies adopted. And the second source of political legitimacy is democracy, which is a response to the question, how should the people be governed? What kinds of institutions should be in place to make collective decisions? And the answer to this question is, of course, that one that appeals to the people authorizing these decisions through some kind of procedure that gives them input into the rules that govern their lives. And then there's the question lurking in the decolonization literature. Who should govern? Who should be included in the state? How should the domain of the state, the territory, be determined? And these are kind of two different questions. They're membership questions and territory questions. And in some sense, they're prior to either of the other two questions because they tell us to whom justice applies and who the people are who get to decide. And of course, for some theorists who examine these, you can examine those two aspects of those questions separately. You could examine what the territory is first and assume the members are everybody on the territory. Or you could examine the members first and then try to look at territory as the area of geographical concentration. And both those moves are made in people who examine theories of territories. So right now, I think I'm going to be confronted by an objection. And maybe the objection isn't so much an objection, but it's maybe that I just went really quickly in linking decolonization with territory. So I'm going to try to pose that as an objection and then respond to it. And I think the objection could take the form that actually what I've just talked about, justice, democracy, and decolonization, aren't really separate values. They're so closely interrelated that if you endorse one, you really have to endorse all. And I'm a little sympathetic to this. So the connection between justice and democracy isn't all that difficult to see. One could argue that we need social equality if political and civil rights are to be meaningful. After all, what's the point of free speech if people are illiterate or can't afford to buy books or newspapers? And you might think the link between these two and decolonization is easy to explain. After all, imperialism was deeply unjust. And if you don't like injustice, you will also be committed to decolonization. And in fact, of course, the imperial orders, the French and the British imperial orders, were unjust. And you might argue also that there's a link between democracy and decolonization. After all, democracy is about self-rule, isn't it? And that's what decolonization is about too. It's making sure that the people are able to rule themselves rather than be ruled by imperial powers. So I think that you could make the argument that all these three things are very interconnected. But I think this is far too quick. And I want to try to argue why those reactions aren't quite right and why decolonization does raise issues about territory and membership. So I want to consider the following hypothetical case. They may sound like a real case, but I haven't done any empirical work to know this is a real case. So I'm just going to say this is a hypothetical case. So imagine that you have a society. Let's call it Somaliland, or S for short, which for various reasons, historical reasons, bad neighborhood, weak institutions, is neither democratic nor just. Human rights are not protected, people's civil and political rights are not protected, and governments rule without being authorized in any way through any recognizable procedure by the people. So this hypothetical society is neither just nor democratic. So would there be anything wrong with another state coming along and extending their democratic system and their institutional structure, their structure which guarantees rights and freedoms and equality before the law, to the people living in this less just and less an undemocratic area? So suppose Kenya, which X hypothesize, is more just and more democratic than its neighbor. Could it gain the territory there on the grounds that this arrangement will be more just and that they will also confer individual democratic rights on Somalians? Would something be lost in this case? And I want to argue that something would be lost, although it's actually a little bit hard to pinpoint what exactly that thing is, partly because we don't theorize it much. But whatever that something is, I think is at the core of the decolonization or anti-imperialism argument. And it's not fully captured by the ideals of democracy or justice. So maybe you're not yet convinced. So I'll give you another case which is closer to my heart. So I am, by origin, a Canadian. And we're taught in school, and it's probably a biased curriculum, but we are taught in school that in the 18th and 19th century, the United States thought that they had a manifest destiny to be the country that ruled over the whole of North America, which of course meant that Canada, or the colonies that became Canada prior to 1867, would have to be incorporated into the United States. Now, so imagine that the United States is just as committed to justice and democracy as Canada is, or that the colonies of Lower and Upper Canada, that became Canada, were. So imagine that the United States extended to all Canadians the right to vote. Now, the right to vote here is, to be sure, the right to vote in United States political institutions. Either the United States Senate or the House of Representatives, or equal rights to have representatives in the Electoral College that picks American presidential candidates. So what does it matter that, so there we have justice and democracy, but Canadians have it in the United States political institutions. So what does it matter if it's Canadian or American, you might say, as long as justice and democracy are served? What is this extra value that we think might be involved, which is distinct and which involves some kind of group self-rule over the territory of Canada among Canadians and not Americans? How do we make sense of that? And that's why I want to say that to understand decolonization, we actually have to think hard about what that thing might be. And I think Olof Palme had this intuition that there is something valuable in itself about collective self-rule. And it's an intuition that I share and that I think many people share. In fact, it's central to understanding the wrong of imperialism. This can't be captured fully by the norms of social justice and democracy. So of course, most imperial powers were unjust and didn't give their subject populations democratic rights. But Olof Palme supported decolonization movements even when it wasn't clear that they would become democratic, and it wasn't clear that they would become just. The thought, I take it, is that people in these places have a right to be collectively self-governing, to rule themselves, and that this group right to self-governance is what undergirds the decolonization movement. And I think it might be related, although I don't discuss this, to an even more fundamental belief that there's something disrespectful in saying to a group that they can't be self-governing, that they don't have the capacity to rule themselves, but they have to be in an institutional arrangement whereby some other group, or even some larger group of which they are a component, is self-governing. But now I think, if we're going to talk about membership and territory, we confront a problem. Because even though I can make the argument that we ought to have some kind of theory about territory, the question is, how do we think about, in cases where people already have states and the membership and territory question is solved, I think that's easy. But in many places that's not true. And then the question is, how do we give an answer to the membership question that doesn't look like something that we now find unacceptable? So let me explain, I hope. So in the 19th century, when liberalism and democracy took root and flourished, they were conjoined with another group-based doctrine, that of nationalism. And even someone with impeccably liberal credentials, so this is a picture of Immanuel Kant writing in the 1790s, assumed without argument and without explaining how really this could fit into his theory, that liberal rights and democratic governance would take place in smaller units because matching cultural nationalist criteria. So he gives an argument for the state connected to the protection of rights, and then he recognizes that this actually could lead to a world state. In fact, there's no reason for in the logic of the argument why it wouldn't justify a world state. But Kant resists that conclusion because he didn't really want a world state. And he then argues, then notes that people tend, as an empirical fact, to be naturally grouped into linguistic or religious collectivities, and so that membership in these cultural groups helps to define particular jurisdictional domains. So in this quote is from Perpetual Peace. He then says, and this is his explanation for rejecting a world state. He says, nature wills it, the world state, otherwise, and uses two means to separate the nations and prevent them from intermingling linguistic and religious differences. So throughout the 19th century, most liberals were also nationalists. They believed that each cultural group had a natural homeland and that democracy could be conjoined with ethnic or cultural self-governance. And this was, of course, at the heart of the 1919 Woodrow Wilson principles, which were premised on the idea of letting people decide the boundaries of the state, which, of course, begs the question, how are they to do so? Because we need to know who are the people who are going to decide before we can let the people decide. And of course, the 1919 Paris Accords are famous for determining who were the people, partly in terms of a plebiscite, partly by reference to the linguistic and cultural map of Europe, and partly by reference to whether the group was on the victorious or defeated side in the war, with defeated countries tending to lose territory and victorious countries to gain it. But the explicit organizing principle was self-government of cultural and linguistic groups. So this, I think, is no longer an accepted move. Now that we've had the experience of fascism in the world, and more recently in the 1990s, the dreadful Balkan Wars, we can no longer be so comfortable with marrying ethnic or cultural criteria with the idea of collective self-government. So our question is not to ignore territory and membership and all those questions, which I think are really pressing, but how can we answer the territory question or the related membership question without appealing to ethnic or cultural criteria? So that's the question. So this brings me to the current state of scholarship on territory and membership, with some exceptions. So I think the main response by theorists today has been to ignore that question. So they do this even while the nation state is the fundamental organizing principle of the international order. We have hardly any discussion of how to draw the boundaries between groups who seek to be self-governing, hardly any discussion of the closely related question of what is the domain, what is the geographical area in which groups should be self-governing. The best that we have is the claim that in the current state order, all states by definition have territory. So this is stated explicitly in international law. There's a 1933 Montevideo Convention on the Rights and Duties of States, and in Article 1 it says that having territory is definitional of states. It says, states are defined as entities with fixed territories and permanent populations under government control and with the capacity to enter into relations with other states. So the thought here is we can justify states and then in the process justify the possession of territory as necessary to fulfill state functions. So this, I think, has been what we've done. It's been the dominant attitude to the issue of territory in international relations, international law, and political science. So if we think about political science, most political science is interested in the relationship between states and citizens, and it assumes that all states have territory. In fact, as international law indicates, you can't be a state unless you have territory. The actual physical domain of the state is left untheorized. In political philosophy or political theory, the central question are the rights and duties of citizens to government. So there's a really important question of political obligation. The dominant theorist, John Rawls, in A Theory of Justice, begins that book by saying, I'm just going to assume one state and it's closed. So there's no possibility of a question about territory arising. So the territory of the state has hardly been theorized at all. So we know states, we can justify states, we know they have territory, but how that geographical domain is determined or what its relationship is to other elements isn't well understood. So this approach, which is just assuming that states have territory and that all states are territorial and maybe we can justify states, is inadequate. And maybe people think that some things don't need to be theorized. We just have them. But I want to argue that it's inadequate, and it's inadequate for three reasons. The first reason is that territorial statehood requires a defense, and if it can't be defended, it should be rejected. So let me elaborate a little bit here, because that's quick. The existence of territorially ordered states should not be assumed as part of the natural ordering of the world, but comes at a cost. So in particular, the division of the world, in fact, the whole world is divided into distinct territorial units. There's nowhere which isn't claimed on Earth. And so it can't be assumed as part of the natural ordering of the world. It comes at a cost, and the division of the world into territorial units is challenged, I think, by the cosmopolitan idea that views borders and territory as inimical to the moral equality of human beings. And I think cosmopolitans typically object to two features that are associated with the territorial states. rights to control resources within the jurisdiction of the states, and rights to regulate borders. So I want to just flesh out the cosmopolitan position, and I'm actually not a cosmopolitan. Well, I am a moral cosmopolitan, but I don't actually adopt the cosmopolitan position, but I do think it absolutely needs to be addressed. So cosmopolitans have argued that resources are part of the common stock of mankind, and that exclusive control by the territorial state is unjustified. The bounty of the earth should be used by everyone. And state control over borders is also criticized on cosmopolitan grounds, that it violates individuals' rights to free movement and equality of opportunity. So I'm not going in this talk to assess these claims, but I do think that at the minimum, this challenge has to be addressed. And to do that, we need to know what is the justifying principle for state territory and state borders. What kinds of liberties, powers, rights, and immunities does it involve? And to what extent is it justified in controlling natural resources and controlling the movement of peoples? Because whatever the justificatory argument is for territory should be able to tell us to the extent to which it can justify these other elements that we associate with having territory. And it might be the justificatory argument doesn't get you all the way to controlling all resources. And I think that's the real reason. So even if we think there should be distinct political communities, there's a real question about what that really involves. More practically, maybe less philosophically, some argue that the territorial state is an outmoded form of organization. So as the world has become more interdependent, many world problems require global responses. And this cannot be affected by a system of independent territorial states. This is true, I think, of human-induced global climate change and environmental degradation generally. Poverty, which is exacerbated by global capitalism and a race to the bottom on the part of competing territorial jurisdictions, international crime and terrorism, many things we might think require a global response. So on practical as well as philosophical levels, the territorial state needs defending. So I'm not actually a cosmopolitan or an anti-territory person. So I think there are obvious benefits to be had from having a state applying uniform laws and common policies to people living in proximity to one another, regardless of their status or identity. I think the territorial state is essential to the realization of equal freedom, equality before the law, predictability, and social justice. But this argument isn't adequate because while it says, I think there should be some rules over territory, because people in proximity are likely to come into conflict, we need rules, it doesn't defend or define the precise territory or domain of the state. It tells us that the world should be ordered somehow territorially, but not how to draw the boundaries of the state. And we need to know this, if we're going to address many international issues like boundary disputes, where boundaries are drawn in the case of secession. This question is called the particularity question. And what it means is that any theory has to have a way to connect particular states to particular territories. And this is necessary not only to address territorial conflicts, such as when two or more states claim the same piece of land, or secession, but also a number of other claims that are now being made, which we may find worrisome, but we have now territorial states making claims to the seabed. There's territorial claims in Antarctica, although there is a treaty, but that treaty will expire, I think in 2053. And there's different claims to the high Arctic. And all of these claims require us to think about what territory is, what is the justificatory argument for them, and how to draw boundaries if we do accept them. Moreover, when states claim rights over territory, they aren't just claiming the right to exercise jurisdiction over the geographical area. So in international law and international relations, the claim over resources isn't just a claim to have control over the resources in which you live. Like you have a river, you get to control the river. The claim is control over the airspace above the country. It's a claim to all the resources all the way down to the core of the earth. And it's also, and the claim is, in international law, a claim of permanent sovereignty. So, I mean, I think you can just tell that that might be hard to fully justify. So when you're claiming, so are we entitled to that? And also, when states claim rights to self-defense, it's very interesting because the right to self-defense isn't a right, is a right actually over territory. So that if a country aggresses against some island in the archipelago, which has no people on it, that justifies, just the act of taking over that island justifies a right of self-defense. And that's interesting because that's not analogous to how personal self-defense works. Because in personal self-defense, an attack on the person gives you a right of self-defense. But if somebody comes into my yard, my property, it doesn't give me a right to shoot them. Not in Sweden, not in Canada anyway. So, so it's interesting because it obviously seems like territory isn't just property and really needs to be theorized. So that's what states claim when they make claims to territory. So I think we need a theory of territory. We need to think hard about what it is, what justifies it, what elements that justification supports, how we are to demarcate it. And I think we have to do this all the while avoiding ethnic or cultural criteria. So that was my other point. So what is a theory of territory? Mine really isn't an explanatory theory, it's really a normative theory. And this is really quick, but I'm just going to say that I take a normative theory as a theory about the appropriate, normatively defensible relationship between the state, people, and land. And any theory has to put those three elements, which are in a kind of triangular relationship, they have to explain how these elements are related, and they have to justify the particular configuration. So you have different theorists just think about it differently. So a Lockean will give you individual property rights, and then they'll justify the state from that. Or you'll get each different theorists, and there are some you can extract theories, all have these three elements in it. And I don't see how you could have an account that didn't have these three elements. So I think to break down those three elements, I'm going to try to think about how to explain the relationship between people and land, and then how to explain the relationship between people and the state and put them into relation. I think that's how a theory would have to go. So I don't think it's that hard to explain the relationship between people and land. Just think about the losses that people experience when they are expelled from land that they live in, quite apart from the coercion that might accompany that event. So it's not hard to think, and I'm not going to belabor the point, because we actually do think people don't have a right not to be expelled. It's not hard to think, to see that people have very strong interests that I think are sufficiently weighty to hold others under a duty, to stay in the place that they reside, to not be expelled from it, and if they are expelled from it, to have a right of return. Because they have interests to live in the place where they make their homes, have their relationships, and make their lives. And I don't think this just applies to sedentary peoples, just in case people think that I have this sedentary picture in mind. I think nomadic peoples also have place-related rights, because nomadic peoples don't just wander around randomly. Nomadic people actually traverse a particular place. So in the desert, they might know a particular oasis. They have a particular place where they herd camels and so on. So they also have place-related rights, I take it, and entitlement to these places. So that's the relationship I want to say, that we can easily think about the relationship between people and land. And I think that relationship, I haven't spelled it out, isn't simply an instrumental relationship of use, of production and consumption. I think that in many ways that relationship is one in which people have an attachment to where they live, and and stronger interest than just instrumental interests. Because if they were purely instrumental interests, you could leave one place and go to another place and it would be equally good. I could say it's not, other than the transition costs. Okay. So then what would and then I guess the next question is, well, given that, so we have on deck the relationship between land and people, why would people want to have some kind of collective agency to make decisions over their lives, right? So if you think about the government as justified, one way in which we could justify it is to say that it enables people to exercise collective forms of self-determination through exercising jurisdiction over their lives in the place that they live. And this is what connects people to the state. The idea here is that making decisions and choices and deciding the rules that they live under, they exercise collective self-determination. So this is, in addition to just democracy and just justice, it actually introduces the idea of collective self-determination. And with respect to the value of self-determination, I think the central picture here is that we have a good idea of what injustice is. We know that injustice is the egregious violation of human rights, killing, expulsion, discrimination, ethnic cleansing. But we also feel that although we have a good idea of what injustice is, we don't always have a clear idea of what the just order of society is. And we think that there's some value in people, or there might be many different ways to justly order our societies. And we think that there's some value in people making those choices themselves over their lives. So that value, of course, is that they as collective self-determination. So that explains the relationship between people and state institutions, and also the value that would be realized in exercising jurisdiction. So I want to say we can link those three things together. But now there's a problem, because the problem, I said earlier that we have to think about linking people and the state, government, in a way that doesn't introduce ethnic and cultural criteria. So here's my attempt. So the challenge I'm going to have to face here is, well, what are the people? So you have the people as being collectively self-determining and people living on land. But it can't be individuals, because collective self-determination is a group-based idea. In fact, jurisdiction is a group-based idea, because an individual can't exercise jurisdiction, only a group can. So how can we do that without bringing back traditional pre-political criteria like ethnicity or group culture, which might be deeply problematic because exclusionary? And also, how do we do that without depending on the idea of a state? Because remember, we don't want to make state the entity that defines the group, because then it looks like the state is assumed, and we get back to a system where we couldn't address many questions, like when two states are rivals. So here I want to try to give an attempt at defining the idea of a collective entity that is non-cultural and non-ethnic, at least in its definition. So here the underlying idea is that we are not atomistic individuals. An important part of our moral landscape is the matrix of relationships that we find ourselves in, identities that we share with others, and many of our interests are collective projects and relationships. And so we can be in these collective projects and relationships. We don't have to we don't have to think of the group as a cultural group, or to think that cultural features are what makes it worthy of being a people or being the holder of territorial rights. So I think the idea of peoplehood could be defined in a way that doesn't introduce cultural or ethnic criteria. And I've introduced three here, which I'm going to give in kind of reverse: political identity, political capacity, and political history, although I wrote that in the wrong order, I think. So I'm just going to say it. So the political capacity principle or requirement refers to, so there's a political identity condition, and that requires that the group is united by a shared aspiration for wide-ranging powers of jurisdictional authority or political control over the territory. So you can think that one of the preconditions of a people being able to exercise collective self-determination is that they want to. I mean, maybe we don't need to share that many things to live in a state together, but one thing that we may need to share is the aspiration to work together collectively to do it. That's pretty fundamental. If we don't have that, I think we can't really exercise jurisdiction properly. Doesn't require shared values of any substantive kind, but it does require that shared commitment. I want to say that I put in a political capacity condition too, which is the ability to exercise self-determination and maintain effective forms of governance. And that's a very strange, you might think that's a strange condition, and I think it is in some ways, but it's pretty clear that you can't give a group, if you think that the value is self-determination, and you're giving groups rights, liberties, powers, and immunities to affect that value, they have to be able to affect that value. If they're unable to do it, they can't realize the value, it can't be justified. And then the third condition is that members of the group have a history of shared practices and mobilization in terms of political projects. And I think that is partly predictive of their ability to exercise jurisdiction. But what I also want to say is that it shows that members of the group are already in a moral relationship with each other, and they want to exercise control over these relationships. So what kinds of groups am I thinking about? Because it sounds really abstract. At this point, you're thinking, oh, right. So clearly the people of Sweden constitute a group, a people, and not necessarily because they share a particular language or culture. Though, as a matter of fact, there may be an important explanatory story why they want to share similar institutions. It's because they have the right kind of political aspirations and capacity, and they want to live together in a state. So many people already live in existing states and have institutions of governance and value these institutions, and that's what makes them a people. But I want to say that the idea of peoplehood may include those who, for various cultural or historic or geographic reasons, seek to exercise self-government amongst themselves, as indigenous people or decolonized people, have the ability to do so, have a history of shared relations and ties forged by political cooperation, but do not yet have a state. So I don't want it to be a static picture where all people that live in states have these aspirations. I think that if a people have the right kind of identity and capacity, and they mobilize over time and in forms of political cooperation, then they constitute a people of the right kind too. So it's a kind of capacious definition. And it includes the possibility that there may be groups who just don't meet the capacity principle for a territorial state, but might have capacity for some forms of self-government. You might think of, in Canada, we would have our indigenous people. I think you have the Sami. So they may be a people who lack capacity for full statehood, but could exercise some forms of collective self-determination. They have claims to place. They have the right kinds of aspirations. And none of this is necessarily mutually exclusive, like as if you only have aspirations with one set. So this brings me back to the reason why it's not okay for the Americans to have manifest destiny over the territory of North America, quite apart from the territorial claims of indigenous people there. It's that Canadians themselves have their own political project, which may be no more or less just than the American one, maybe no more or less just than, or democratic than the American one, but that they aspire to be in relations with each other, and they need to have jurisdictional authority to manage that relation and not be subsumed within the American project. And this thought, I think, is at the heart of the decolonization project, that people are agents and not just subjects, and that their historical and collective preferences, interests, and aspirations are worthy of being respected. I could end here, but I didn't. I just felt now like maybe I should end this, but I think I have more. Okay, sorry. So I said that rights over territory wasn't just the right over a domain to exercise jurisdiction. States also made other claims. In particular, they make the claim that they are entitled to full resources and they're entitled to control over borders. And these are central controls over their territory. So jurisdiction isn't the whole story here. And now the question is, once I've put this on deck, this idea that there's a group and the group is already in relations with each other, and they're in the right order, in the right relationship with place, and the value is collective self-determination, what does this mean for the right for resources and the right for control of borders? What else can we justify those? Because that's actually, I think, a really important question. And I think there's a really important question when people talk about rights over territory, is whether they can control the flow of goods and people across borders. I think the most contentious issue is that of human migration. And at present, we assume that control over borders is part of territorial sovereignty. I mean, you might link the territorial sovereignty in different places. It could be at the EU, it could be in a state. But implicit in territorial sovereignty is a right to control borders. And I think we have to explain this. And I think the story that I've told has something to say about this right. I think it's possible to argue that states are justified in exercising control over migration connected to their interest in self-determination, that this interest has to be limited in various ways, especially when it conflicts with the human rights of the prospective migrants. And the reason I have that on board is because I said that self-determination, that justice was a value, democracy was a value. So self-determination tells us amongst acceptable kinds of ways of ordering that you can be self-determining, but doesn't give you the right to do anything that is not, that violates human rights. So, but I think there is a self-determination interest in controlling migration. And this is actually hard to argue given, I have very mixed feelings about this part of the argument, but I think this is right. I think that we have to accept that there are good reasons why a collectively self-determining group, which has control over the conditions of their existence, which is part of what it is to have jurisdictional authority, would seek to have control over who, and especially how many, enter their political community. And that's because having control over many aspects of one's collective life, if you have control over education policies, healthcare policies, services, they're impacted by issues connected to demographic balance between rural and urban communities, the rate and flow of migrants, the kind of migrants that one accepts. So at some level, it would be difficult for political communities to make collective choices without some capacity to make choices over this vital component of many different policies. It would be hard to see how a political community could exercise significant control over the collective conditions of their existence if they lacked this kind of control. And here, I just couldn't get out of my mind the situation in Canada when Métis and Indigenous people were given a province, Manitoba, and it was majority Indigenous. And then, of course, what happened is what they didn't have was control over migration. So in 20 years, it was over, right? So equal rights. I mean, they also didn't have actually voting rights, but they had their own forms of control. Okay, but I think the difficulty with migration, and here's where I'm is getting right the appropriate lens of analysis. And here's where I think it's a very difficult issue. The problem here is that the appropriate way to think about the justification for institutions is not whether a particular right or rule or principle can be justified to each affected individual or person taken alone. Rather, as with private property rights, the justification is at the level of the system of plural territories or of connected territorial rights. So that is to say, and here's where I think the lens of analysis is hard. It would be impossible to show that the political community's interest in excluding an individual, a prospective migrant, could outweigh that individual's interest in entering the political community. Prospective migrants often have a significant interest in being admitted, and it's doubtful that there could be a significant countervailing interest that the community could have to exclude the particular individual from entering the state. But I think that might not be the right way to think about it, because there's a fallacy of composition here. A fallacy of composition infers that something is true of the whole from the fact that it is true of some part of the whole or even every part of the whole. And we know that's not true. We know that from zero-sum games like athletic races, where the fact that someone would win if she ran faster doesn't mean that everyone would win if everyone ran faster, right? And in the case of the regulation of borders, every single prospective migrant who seeks to live peaceably in the community will not have a deleterious effect on the self-determination of that political community. However, it does not follow that having many millions of migrants entering one's political community will have no effect on the self-determination of that community. And that's what makes that a particularly troubling issue, because we see the problem always from both perspectives. And in fact, you can see this on, and this is just an aside, but you can see this when people are asked, they look at a particular case and they say, well, do you think this person should be let in? And everyone says, yes, absolutely. And then you say, well, do you think you should have open borders? And they say, no. And I think it's the two different thoughts, which suggests only that some regulation of rate and flow and so on. So And obviously, whatever policy has to be adopted has to be consistent with human rights, because I earlier claimed that self-determination doesn't involve the right to just do anything, but to do things within the scope or limits of justice. And then finally, I want to talk about resources. Because it's usually thought that a legitimate state has control over the natural resources within its territory. And in international law, it's called a permanent sovereignty over resources claim. So can this account justify such a right? And I think that the interest in collective self-determination does suggest that the state, as a vehicle of self-determination, ought to have some control over resources. And here I think one of the most interesting examples is in the United States, the Lakota Sioux have claimed that the Black Hills are sacred. And the United States government illegally took their land and started mining the Black Hills. And there was an American court case that indicated that the Lakota Sioux were entitled to compensation. But the Lakota Sioux said they didn't want compensation. They don't want money. What they want is the mining stopped. If they're going to seriously have any control over the conditions of their existence, where they live their lives, then what they want is they want control over the rules that are made and not compensation for something that they think is profoundly wrong. So I think that suggests that if a group is to have robust self-determination rights, they have to exercise some control over the land that they live in, the rivers that they swim in, that they drink. And that suggests that there is an entitlement to resources where you live. Of course, that's a subject to important limitations, because other people outside the state may also have important claims. But note that the claim here is a claim of control. It isn't a claim to the full stream of benefits that comes from that control. So if the Lakota Sioux gain control of the Black Hills and then decide to mine it, they change their mind, which they're entitled to do, so they mine it, then I think it's perfectly okay to tax it, to tax the revenue, and engage in redistribution projects. So just because you have rights of control doesn't give you the right to the full stream of benefits. I think it has to be clearly compatible with some forms of distributive justice globally, because we live in a very unequal world. And in conclusion, I want to say something about the way in which this account views resources, which I think is a little bit different from the way in which it's often viewed. So the picture that I've provided doesn't view land or territory as analogous to property. In fact, territory isn't the same as land, right? Land is the part of the Earth's surface that's not covered by water, whereas territory is political, so states are claiming territory into the oceans and airspace and all sorts of things, right? So, but I'm also claiming that territory is different from property, and I'm justifying territory as in terms of the domain of self-determination, where people have entitlement to make rules over their lives, including rules about property, rules of property acquisition, transfer, and the like. So on this account, the control over resources isn't derived from a property-like interest. It's just a dimension of the exercise of our control in the external world. So that's how the picture I have. So the idea is, in my account, is that people have entitlement for control over the places where they live, right? Because that's where they exercise self-determination. But many states making claims for territory, not where anybody lives. There are claims to the seabed. There's claims to the ocean. There's claims to both poles which are uninhabited. There's unoccupied islands in the South China Sea are the subject of what are called territorial disputes. But I don't think they're genuine territorial disputes or justify territorial disputes, because they're not about the people's self-determination in the place where they live. That's a property dispute. They want access to property because they think that it's going to enrich their political community. And in fact, as soon as there is some hint that there might be gas under some seabed, then you have lots of different claims. So those are property disputes. And there, I think, so they're not territorial disputes. And if they're a property dispute, then the real problem is we need a jurisdictional authority to regulate that property dispute. We don't have one. We have no robust international institutions to regulate those property disputes. Maybe it's the case that a particular state could make a claim, but they can't make a self-determination claim to extract resources in such places. The claim that they could make, maybe, is that in the absence of robust international agencies, we need somebody to exercise a stewardship function over these unoccupied places, because to leave it for a free-for-all may be the worst possible thing. But then it suggests that actually stewardship becomes a really important principle here. And I think as well that the way in which I was thinking about territory also suggests some form of a stewardship function, because I was suggesting that there's an important link between people and land. And I don't think the relationship between people and land, if we think hard about it, is exhausted by our relations of production and consumption. Sure, we produce, and that might give rise to desert-like claims under justified rules. And we consume, there's need-based claims. But we are related to land in many, many more ways than just production and consumption. So that when a group makes a claim about land, I think they are often making a claim about the importance of the place, which you see in literature and in art all the time, which we are not used to making because we just think about it because we don't think about it, actually. It's hard to think about what would be the claim that a group could make to a land that is not just fully instrumental. So I think what it does is it directs us, because we're now viewing territory not as analogous to private property, it directs us to different ways in which we interact with land and with place. And it forces us to think about that place as central to the self-determination of a group conceived of as a transgenerational entity, as a place we make rules over consistent with justice. I have a picture here. And that means that we have to think about territory and resources as something we hold in trust for future generations, and we have to justify it in those terms. And this picture, I think, nicely complements the picture that I think we have all internalized since human beings went to space, which is that we live on this small blue planet hurtling through space, that we are in a sort of intergenerational partnership with each other in which we have to manage our relationship to land and to the Earth's resources. Thank you very much. Tack.